Hi guys, Patrick here, Ignot Poker. Today we're going to be focusing on a separate video, mainly focusing on single raising, three betting, and four betting, starting from pre-flop and moving into post-flop. So we're going to be looking and thinking about some situations that we've gone over in a couple of different previous videos, but in a little bit more depth, specific to being the aggressor and the defender in single raise, three bet, and four bet pots moving into post. So we touched on a previous video where we were going through some concepts and some considerations when we're three betting, single raising, four betting, etc., or facing them. Now we're going to go through some scenarios and look through the post-flop streets and think about what kind of post-flop considerations we now can face and use, and what strategies might be useful. Quick disclaimer is, again, this might vary depending on what stakes you play, what population tendencies you may face. For example, if you're playing, say, 2NL, playing 50NL, etc., the types of populations you're going to face are going to be very different, right? So, the game's going to change dramatically and your strategies are going to deviate quite heavily. So this is mainly focused on micro stakes moving into low stakes. So from 2NL up to, say, 25, 50NL. So we're going to start off with being the single raiser. Let's start off with single raise. Let's keep it simple. So we'll do a few single raise spots in a few different scenarios and what kind of thought processes we're going to put in place. So let's start. So I've got Card Player here, which is basically just a little simulator where I can sort of push around different hand types and what kind of equities they may have. So this is just a nice little simulation to use and a decent piece of study information, the study tool. This is cardplayer.com. So we're going to start off, you say to ourselves that we're under the gun. We're going to select some different sizes and different hands, and we're going to play some simulations and talk about them. So let's get started. So let's make it interesting to begin with, and let's say we're under the gun, six-handed at, say, a 2NL table. So we're going to be opening one of the weakest parts of our range, UTG. So let's go with Queen Jack offsuit. Queen Jack club heart here. Folds around to the big blind, and the big blind three bets us. So they've got any two cards. We don't know what range they have. The only consideration here, this is nice and simple, is this one's going to be a pure fold. Nice and simple. This is bottom of our range. Different hand class. Let's go with a hand like, let's go with now a strong hand. Let's go with, say, ace king offsuit. So our considerations in a single raise pot versus the big blind, again, what type of player we're against? Well, for this simulation, we're going to say to ourselves that we're up against a complete unknown. We're playing 2NL. We have no idea what our opponent is or who we're facing. Let's do a single raise version and then we'll do a three bet version. So let's say we single raise UTG ace king, face a big blind defend, and here we are. So let's think about a couple of different board textures and think about what we can do. So first of all, let's give ourselves a relatively easy hand texture. So let's give ourselves a dry top pair, king 7-4 rainbow, big blind checks to us, and here we are. So obviously we got a very easy decision. We want to start putting some money in. We're against an unknown player at micro stakes. We're looking to go for three streets. So the first consideration here is we've got no information on the opponent. Fine. Okay, let's go back to fundamental. How strong is our hand? Is this a type of mergy hand? Is this a very strong hand? Is this a hand that wants to try and get to showdown cheaply? What type of board texture is it? Well, first of all, we're basically top of range. We've got top pair, top kicker. Board's relatively good. We're going to have the best hand here a lot of the time. So what kind of c-bet size should we choose or should we check? Well, to be honest, reminding ourselves that at these low stakes and micro stakes, we're mainly focused on just fundamental. So we're not really focused on what our range wants to do technically. We're more focused on what we want to do in a vacuum to make the most money. So we're going to be looking to bet somewhere in the region of 25%. Up to about, say, 2/3, 3/4. You can choose different sizes if you wanted to be in a GTO world. You can do this hand, in theory, would want to always bet. It would mostly be betting very, very small, but it would also do some mixed large and overbet sizes as well. Let's say, for example, for the sake of argument, that we went with a third range bet and we got called. Nice and simple. So what we want to look at is what type of board textures change our thought processes. So, for example, if a card like, what's a nice simple card? Let's go with the 9 of clubs. So villain checks the turn, and here we are. Again, nice easy spot to go for value, right? Well, yes, obviously. we're looking for spots where we can be very exploitative with our opponents, right? So when we've got a hand this strong, we want to just be sledging money at this point. We want to be in a sort of push fold type of mindset, which basically means in this sort of exploitative environment against might not be recreational, but in a micro stakes environment against check call with this type of hand strength, we look to be sledging money and potentially folding and looking to overfold versus aggression, because we just assume, not always knowing, but assuming that villains check raises are going to be very strong, especially on these sort of drier textures at micro stakes. So we're basically saying, look, we're going to be putting tons of money in unless we face loads of aggression. So this is a spot where we're not looking to get trappy, we're not looking to check, we're not looking to bet small. We'd be looking to either sledge over bets or large bets. You can also mix between some different sizings as well, but generally our range is very, very strong here. And also we're trying to extract value from worst king X, from hands like 5-6, from hands like backdoor clubs, like, I don't know, like ace jack of clubs, for example, has picked up a flush draw. At a micro stakes, they may well call two streets with a 7, pocket 5s. You don't really know at this level. So we're looking to go 3/4 or over bet to try and reduce that SPR and try and get as much money in as possible. So let's say, for example, we go for an over bet on this time and we go for, let's say, 125. 125% that is, and we get called. Excellent. Okay, well, now we need to start looking at some rivers. So let's go with, what's a really, really good one? Let's go with the 8 of clubs. So that makes it a little bit more difficult for us. And let's say our opponent now decides to lead this card. And let's say they lead for about 3/4 to 80%, relatively large. So this is the point in the hand where you start now considering, how good is my hand now in terms of the board? I don't need to meet minimum defense frequencies at these stakes. I don't need to worry about being binned. Basically, I don't need to worry about being bluffed. I don't really need to worry too much about anything except, can I make money in the hand by calling or raising or folding? What's the best option? I would suggest that, let's say, micro stakes, 2NL, 10NL, for example, if you face this backdoor flush and straight, remember 5-6 and backdoor clubs get there, and then your opponent leads 75 to 80%, I would now consider potentially folding, as tight as that sounds. It's really difficult because these are really specific vacuum scenarios, right? I'm just trying to give you some simple but then difficult spots at the end to try and talk through them, because I want you to start thinking about it. So these are spots that are going to come up somewhat regularly at micro stakes. Specifically is when these sort of board dynamics change and your opponent then leads. If you have information, great, but a lot of the time you're not going to have information. When you're in these types of situations, try not to autopilot and just start thinking about, oh well, I've got top, I'm facing a lead for huge, it's just a nice easy call, right? You don't have to think about how high up you are in your range. Technically speaking, if you feel like your villain doesn't really have many bluffs that get here, and technically they don't really, then it's not really worth bluff catching to an extent. Unless you know your opponent's a bit sporadic and a bit weird, then fine. You know, if your opponent leads small, fine, okay. But if your opponent leads large in this size, I would consider folding, because 5-6 improves. Backdoor clubs can get there, which you unblock, which is somewhat relevant. And also, how many villains tend to call pre, check call flop, check call turn, and then lead for a huge size on the river when the texture changes with a hand like top pair or a hand like 4-5. They're turning, a 7 into a bluff here. They're turning, straight blockers into bluffs, and so it's not really happening, is it? So I would probably consider folding here. Let's give ourselves another scenario where we're in a single raise pot where we're opening from the button. So let's say we're on the button this time. We'll keep ourselves here, but we're on the button and we open a hand. Let's give ourselves a strong hand. So let's go with a hand like ace king offsuit. So we open on the button. And the big blind defense. I tell you what, to make it simplistic, let's put ourselves over here, because I think a lot of people play here when they're the hero in hands. So let's go ourselves with a button here, and then we'll say the big blind's here this time. So they've got any 2 cards and they defend. Keep it simple for now. Actually, no, let's go with a different hand. Let's keep it simple. There we go. We've got queen jack suited. Let's mix it up. Big blind defense, we open on the button, big blind defense, and here we are. Let's give ourselves a different dynamic. So let's give ourselves, what's a good one? Ace, king, tray, rainbow. Villain checks in the big blind, and here we are. So this is an interesting one. So there's different avenues for what you can do in terms of theory here and what might be good. So what I want you to do quickly at home is think about this situation. We're on the button, big blind's defended, and here we are with this board texture. What type of c-bet sizes, what type of checking size, what type of checking strategy or c-betting strategy would you use in this situation if you were playing at micro stakes? Just think about that for a second. So technically, in theory, when these boards are like ace, Broadway, X, button on big blind, in theory at least, you should most of the time be incorporating really large and overbets and checks. That's basically because your range is going to absolutely demolish this board, or you're going to have a lot of parts of your range that are not going to want to bet. You can also do a very small amount of small C betting, which is completely fine as well. Your range is very, very strong and nutted, and your opponent struggles to hit this board in a powerful capacity. So, for example, the big blind's never realistically going to have aces, kings, ace, king, ace, queen here, in theory. You can also think about having a check bet because you've also got nut showdown value, nut straight draw, and a backdoor flush draw. So betting this and getting raised by, say, king 3 suited or, the same type of hand is a bit of a disaster, right? And you wouldn't be looking to fold, but it would just bloat the pot and make things a little bit more difficult for you. In an exploit situation, though, because we're trying to be more exploit based at these micro and low stakes, I would probably reach towards going for the smaller c-bet size and deviating from GTO, because we want to basically be saying, look, we're not really looking at our hand specifically, we're just looking at the board. Your populations are going to be overfolding flops, especially the bigger scary boards, and they're going to be under check raising. Again, this is subjective, but I mean, over long periods of time, you're going to probably agree with me, I would hope. These guys are going to mainly defend against you when they've got pretty decent hands. Like they've got some kind of pair, got some kind of draw, or very good backdoor hand or something like that. They're not really going to be getting too out of line. So a small c-bet would just look to probably just take it down most of the time. I don't want to sound subjective and say probably and go on assumptions, but just keep things simple for yourself, okay? If I was paying 100 an hour, 200 an hour, and I was looking at this board texture, I would mostly be checking or overbetting this hand and this board texture. That's how I'd be playing. If I was playing at 10 an hour, I would mostly be just betting a third or 25% most of the time. Maybe sometimes going a bit bigger and polarized, but just looking to take it down most of the time because I make life easier. Remember, your populations tend to, I dare say, under check raising is one thing, under defending in general is another. But your boys also tend to bet when checked to, which is good when you're controlling the pot size with a relatively decent showdown hand or a relatively good trap. But it's not so good when you've got a hand which plays well in theory against a strong opponent, but doesn't play well against an opponent who's going to sort of blow up and over bluff against you because they think your check is dust, basically. So let's keep things simple. Let's say, for example, we bet a third and our opponent raises us. We only have information that this opponent is a relatively weak, tight opponent. They're not really check raising that wide. They're basically value heavy and very nutted and basically waiting for the nuts or a really, really good hand. So in this situation, facing a check raise, I wouldn't ever look to be folding directly unless your opponent massively raises huge. So if they're check raising, say, 4 to 6x times what you've bet, I might just consider folding directly. If they make a sort of maybe a micro stake standard raise of say 3x and you're in position with a backdoor flush draw and a nut straight draw, I would consider calling. But don't be fooled. Generally, these boys are very, very strong when they're check raising as well. So just be a little bit careful. Let's say for sake of argument, we got check raised small and we called, and then the turn binked our favorite turn. So I don't want to make this really, really, really simple, but just want to go with it. And then your opponent bets about, say, half pot to 2/3, and here we are. Exploitatively, we now want to be looking to absolutely sledge because your opponent is basically representing a hand like a set of threes, maybe a slow played ace king, ace. It might have ace 3, something like that. As we block queen jack, it's probably unlikely that he's got the same type of hand. So I'd be looking to raise turn and get as much money in as possible, and then look to shove rivers rather than. Don't think that this is now a spot to call, okay? We're not looking at sort of strategy. We're just looking at fish in a vacuum, right? Now we can look to start putting money in. However, let's give ourselves a difficult turn. There we go. So we've now made a pair to go with our gut shot. And our opponent continues for, say, 2/3, 3/4, that sort of standard type sizing. This card is not, in theory, this card might be good enough to now continue and sometimes raise. not never folding with a pair and a gut shot. However, in your populations, this isn't good enough to continue. Your opponent's tight, strong range on the flop. I mean, he shouldn't really have hands like I wouldn't expect hands like King Jack and Ace Jack very often, but your opponent is just representing a super strong hand from the flop, and the turn hasn't changed anything for your hand. You've given a little bit more equity on this turn, but now we're looking just to fold. Honestly, this is not the situation that we'd be looking to call with, so I would now be looking to fold. Let's give ourselves another scenario for another single raise. Now we're going to be in the small blind. So let's say, for example, we open a wider range in the small blind, so we'll go with Jack 9 off. And our opponent defends the big blind, so they just call. Okay, these are just single raise pots to begin with. Now let's give ourselves an ace-high texture, which is relatively dry. Let's make it rainbow again to make it nice and simple. There we go, ace 7-5 rainbow. In general, in the small blind, theoretically, we're now looking to do a lot of checking, checking and small betting. That's what our range now wants to look to do. We can now start range betting in general, which is going to be very effective because it's going to be very hard for the big blind to defend correctly, especially at the low stakes. They're not going to be raising you very wide. They're going to have a difficult time finding raises on this board. Also, just in general, your villains at micro and low stakes are just generally going to be folding and not floating that wide. Again, disclaimer, I don't want to say anything as an assumption, but just as a general population tendency. Looking at sizes here, you could again mix between sizes, but you would genuinely be, your range would be preferring checking and small bet. This hand here specifically would really benefit from taking it down now. So we can mix between a small bet and sometimes have a bit more of a polarized size, like a 70% or a 60%, but mainly thirding. So let's say, for example, we bet a third. Let's go with our opponent as a call, moving into the turn, and let's go with the Queen of Spades. So we don't really pick up anything at all, unfortunately. However, this is where the fun begins. So now that you've bet a small size on the flop, your opponent's range is now going to be a little bit wider because you haven't selected a large size, which has kind of polarized them. Your opponent may call with a hand like King Queen. Your opponent may call with a hand like a 5, a 7, pocket 4s, King Jack of clubs. They may have a 7. They may have pocket 4s. They may just have anything, right? They may have 6-8, 3-6, 6-9, gut shots, those kind of bits and bobs. Lots of continues, but now don't really get to the turn very well. You're not looking to fold out a hand like Ace-X, right? But we can absolutely start bidding a 5, a 7, marginal pairs, and those type of weaker gut shots. We're blocking some hands that might continue, hands like King Jack, which is really good, and 10 Jack, which is really, really good, had they floated for the sake of argument. So sizing then. Now we want to start mixing between larger bets and over bets, which now basically saying, look, our range has become very strong on this queen. We have more ace queen than you in theory, but we have more pocket queens. Because we're betting small and range betting so often on in this position, we will also be checking some hands, but mostly range betting. Our range is just going to hit pretty hard on this queen. But we will also be doing a lot of checking with hands, so like pocket jacks, with marginal or weak ace-x to protect our range some of the time. We might range bet some queen-x, that's going to definitely check the turn. This hand here, Jack 9, absolutely wants to benefit from fold equity. We don't want to say, look, we're giving up because we got a jack, even though we have no direct equity. The thing that we need to be focusing on is the fact that our range is very, very strong. We have all the nutted hands. We have ace-5, we have ace-7, we have 7-5, we have 7s, 5s. We have ace-queen, aces, ace-king, pocket queens, things that our opponent doesn't, right? And our nutted edge is very strong. And we're not going to be doing that with our entire range, but this hand specifically here would love to go ahead and sledge the turn. So I'd love to see a 75 to say 150% size on the turn and absolutely hammer that pressure. That would be good here. Having a smaller size specifically in these situations, especially at micro stakes and low stakes, is kind of a mistake. Going for a half pot, again, is kind of a mistake. If you're going to take a larger size, I would generally suggest an overbet and then potentially bluffing rivers or giving up depending on villain type. If we've got a bit of a loose calling station who calls the turn, or a nit who calls the turn, I'd be looking to basically give up. If you've got a sort of somewhat weaker average reg, I'd be looking to slam rivers and really force them to overfold their weaker and marginal turn calls, like a hand like ace-6 off, for example, things like that. So that's a couple of single raise scenarios and a few hands there. So now let's focus on single raise defense. So let's say, for example, we are in the, what's a good scenario? Let's say UTG opens. So we give them an ace there, and then we defend in the big blind. Let's say it folds around and we defend in the big blind. Let's give ourselves a hand like 5-6 suited. Very pretty. UTG opens. We don't have any information on our opponent. We have absolutely no idea what we're doing. We're at 50 NL. We can absolutely 3-bet this at a very small frequency. Well, I say very small, around sort of 20-25% of the time, I think, off the top of my head, in GTO world anyway. If you're against a micro stakes to low stakes population, which again at the end of the day, what this video is based on, I would now start considering prioritizing a call or a fold, depending on what type of opponent and what type of stack sizes you have. We have no information, but we feel like we can outplay our opponent. This should definitely be a call most of the time, and closer to pure in theory anyway. So let's call and let's move to a flop. So let's give ourselves a couple of different scenarios. So let's give ourselves a difficult flop first. We check in the big blind on the ace king tray and our opponent bets. Say, for example, they bet say 25 or 30%. These types of situations are very, very simple and easy because you don't have anything. There are a couple of backdoors, but your opponent's range is so strong and they're going to be double barreling and just having a lot of really strong hands in general that this is an absolutely really, really easy trivial fold. Really simple, nice, nothing else to say. If I was to change the board texture, however, so let's go with a range like... There we go. So we've got 8-6-4, 2 hearts. So we flopped middle pair and a gut shot. So this is where things can get interesting. So generally, in theory, again, we should be looking to mainly play this in two ways. We'd either be donking this board texture because our range will heavily favor these lower to mid type boards, because our range is just going to be rifled with hands like pocket fours, pocket sixes, which our opponent doesn't always have technically. Hands like 6-4 suited, 8-6 suited, 5-7 suited, 6-9. Just in general, we're going to be looking to have more flushes as well, flush draws and flushes moving into the turn, which is going to massively favor us. So we can absolutely look to have a donking range. One thing with the donking range, which would be a small size, for example, I would probably not suggest doing it at all, if I'm honest with you. Even though the solvers love it, against these micro and low stakes opponents, I've tried donking a little bit. And again, I don't want to be subjective here, but I think it only induces your opponent to play better, if actually more aggressive, against your leads. So for example, they just have overpairs or they have bluffs and they will raise you more, assuming that your leads are weak. Whereas if they, assuming that in a GTO situation, you're forcing your opponent to be in a difficult situation with a lot of his marginal opens. You could have a hand like King Jack of spades, for example, and you've led this flop into him because you've got a range and nut advantage on, with the straights, etc. anyway, and some of the sets. But you're putting a lot of pressure on him. Whereas at a micro and low stakes scenario, you don't really know how wide they're going to float. You don't really know how wide they might turn hands into bluffs because you've shown or you've looked to show weakness. So what I might suggest here is avoiding those donking ranges at these stakes and be looking to play these as check calls or check raises, depending on how strong the board is and how strong your hand is. So in this situation, I would be looking to check and primarily call. Because we made a pair, we got a gut shot, we got backdoor flush draw, I wouldn't be looking to raise this almost ever. I'd be looking to basically play turns, realize some equity. We're ahead here a decent amount of the time. We don't really need to do anything else other than check. So let's say for the sake of argument, we check and our opponent bets, and let's say they bet, say, half pot. Half pot seems to be the go-to size on these wet coordinated textures for these lower stakes boys. Excuse me, as far as I can see. Again, subjective. We're going to play this as a call and moving into the turn. So a couple of different turn cards. So let's give ourselves a horrible turn first. So the ace of diamonds doesn't improve our range, massively improves our villain's range. Let's say we check and then they bet. Again, here they should be absolutely looking to go for large bets or checks, some small sizes, but their range is very polarized here. Some of their weaker ace X and a lot of their underpairs and hands like that, and don't really want to do a lot of betting on this turn, whereas their nutted edge and a lot of their bluffs will absolutely want to start sledging into this turn because they can put a lot of pressure on. If we didn't get raised on the flop with an ace X, for example, or semi-bluff on the flop, if we were the villain, we can absolutely put a lot of pressure on the turn. Our hand is pretty decent and strong enough to continue against a continuation bet on the turn, even against overbet in most scenarios because we have a pair and a direct straight draw. I would be careful here though, and I would heavily start considering folding these turns because your opponents are going to basically have a very strong edge with their betting and they're not really going to give up on too many rivers. Even at the lower stakes, I would assume. I would think their ranges are just very strong and honest, and if they're not, they most of the time don't really bet, give up. And again, I know that's subjective, but I would think this is a spot where we would actually be looking to potentially fold. If I was playing at a decent level, I would consider calling, but against most sort of fishy and lower levels, again, I would be looking to fold. So now let's put ourselves into a different scenario. So let's say we are now the let's say that we're now the 3-better in some scenarios. So let's give our opponent let's mix it up a bit. Let's say our villain opens in the cutoff. So they've got a decently strong range, but a bit more marginal with a lot of their hands. And let's say we're 3-betting from the button. Let's put them over here. So let's give ourselves a couple of different types of hands that may 3-bet. So let's give ourselves a couple of polar bluffs first. So let's give ourselves King 5 suited. I think that's fair to say. Our opponent opens, say 2.5x as standard. We 3-bet the King 5 suited. Folds around to the cutoff here, sorry, and the cutoff defends. Let's give ourselves some flop textures. So, what's a good one? Let's give ourselves a dry Queen X board. So, button on cutoff. Ranges are going to be a little bit wider. They're not going to be super nutted. And our opponent hasn't 4-bet us, so in theory, they should be a bit more capped. They're going to still have some strongish hands, but they're not supposed to have hands like Ace-Queen, King-Queen suited as much. Or sorry, Ace-Queen suited as much. Or Ace-Queen offsuit even. Not supposed to have many hands like Pocket Jacks, Pocket Tens. That's theory-based, and we need to dumb that down and be fundamental. If you're playing at micro stakes and low stakes, again, I would be very, very cautious about these like sort of 10 high, Jack high, Queen high boards in 3-bet pots where you've 3-bet and been called by the initial opener, because they will absolutely have more than they should hands like Ace Queen off. They're going to have more hands like Pocket Queens. They're going to have more hands like Jacks and Tens. They're going to have more hands like Ace King. So be wary of what type of board textures you start sledging into. Your hand here has some decent properties though. We block a hand like King Queen suited. We've got a backdoor flush draw. So we can, and we obviously have a nut advantage. We've got more hands like Ace, Queen, and Queens, in theory. So we can absolutely start putting pressure again. This is not the type of hand that wants to now start checking back, pot controlling, or however you want to start looking at it. This hand doesn't really have a lot of showdown. It's very weak king high. We can put a lot of pressure on some better king high and ace eyes that haven't connected with the board. And like ace jack of hearts, for example. Something like that. That would be a really, really good hand that we could put pressure on. Hand like pocket sevens, for example, ace king offsuit, something like that. So again, sizings. Generally in these 3-bet pots, you can have a lot of different sizes, but I would keep things simple on these super dry boards. Exploitatively, I would again suggest you start just doing small, 25, 30, 33% or so. In the GTO world, on the queen high textures, you start to mix between sort of, you do some small sizes as well, but you mainly start focusing on sort of middling to larger sizes or checks in most spots. Again, this is quite specific to what positions you're in. Because the queen high boards, you don't have hands like Queen 5 suited, Queen 6 suited, Queen 7, Queen 8. You don't have these marginal queens. You don't have a lot of queens. You have all the nutted queens like Ace Queen, King Queen, Queen Jack, etc., but you don't really hit them with a lot of marginal smaller hands. So, for example, you may 3-bet a hand like Ace 7 suited, Ace 8 suited, Ace 9 suited, King 9 suited, etc. You hit the aces and the kings more often, and you have more of those nutted hands. With the Queen 8, you can't really just get away with default range betting in most situations. However, again, going back to fundamental exploit strategy, if you're in 3-bet pots, I would most of the time, especially on these dry single Broadway textures, just default to a third size, because your opponents are just going to keep the game real easy for you, and you're going to make life real easy by betting small and then sledging on some turns and rivers as well. So let's say, for example, for the sake of argument, that we take a 30% size, 33% size or so, a third, and our villain continues. They continue as a call. So what's a really interesting turn card? Let's pick up a spade draw and let's go with the 3 of spades. Our villain checks to us, and here we are. Well, now that we're in a situation where the board is paired, this is a good turn card. We picked up a flush draw, and it also limits the combinations of pocket 3s to only one combo, which is really, really good, because that's going to make our villain's nutted edge of hands a little bit lower than it would normally be on an offsuit card, on a different type of card. Also, a lot of his hands that would call the flop have now not improved. So, for example, if he had a hand like ace-x of clubs, or like, jack-10 of diamonds, or king-jack of diamonds, ace-10 of clubs, whatever, he's now not really, like, we also block the backdoor spades, which is good. So he's going to have a lot more natural folds. His middling pairs, some of his weaker marginal eight-x, his pocket 7s, pocket 9s, whatever, they're going to struggle now on this turn card. So we're going to actually generate a lot more fold equity as well. You could potentially consider checking back with the second nut flush draw, but remember, this combo doesn't really have a lot of showdown value. For example, if we had some other combos like ace-10 of spades, ace-king of spades, things like that, they have a bit more showdown value, and they don't really want to bet and face a raise. They can absolutely bet, but they also benefit from checking sometimes to protect your range, technically, and they don't really want to get binned. I would suggest that we are only betting now with king 5 of spades, and now we're picking again a larger size because the board is paired. We're a bit more polarized again. We'd be doing a decent amount of checking here with a hand like queen jack suited, for example. We'd be doing a decent amount of checking with hands like pocket jacks. We'd be doing a decent amount of checking with some of our nut flush draws, etc. We wouldn't also default bet here with ace king. We can do some checking on turns as well, although we generally favor betting if we bet the flop. Anyway, we'd be looking for, again, a larger size to an overbet size, around sort of 2/3, 3/4, moving into sort of 125, 150 territory, I would say, putting a lot of pressure on, again, those marginal calls on the flop. So let's take a 75% sizing, and let's say that our villain calls. So we've been called twice in this 3-bet pot. Not super thrilled, right? Let's make our life really difficult, and let's give ourselves the... What's a good one? So let's give ourselves the ace of diamonds. Haha. So now what? Basically. Now, this is an interesting situation because you can go one of two ways. Genuinely, you could argue first avenue that your range and your nutted range that bets a flop and bets a turn, like pocket queens, ace queen, aces, ace-x of spades, for example, has massively improved. So technically your nutted edge has improved again. However, there's a lot of hands that don't like this river. So you're going to have hands like pocket kings. You're going to have hands like king queen. You're going to have some other hands that don't really like this river that may bet the turn. This is an interesting one towards betting the river and checking. Now, we block a hand like king queen of spades, which is really good for us, right? So we do block some of those hands. The ace of diamonds does technically remove some of his ace queen x as well. If he did defend a hand like ace queen offsuit with a diamond, that's now been removed, which is also good. So his nutted hands have also dramatically reduced in quantity. Other side of things, the strongest part of his calling range that call on the flop and turn would be a hand like king queen ace queen. So apart from ace queen, or say ace-x of spades, again, be it like hands like ace-9 of spades, ace-10 of spades, they're not even super thrilled to call this river. Even though we block spades, I would say our nutted edge is strong enough where we can sometimes bet here and sometimes check. We basically, our villain's going to get here with a lot of strong queen x, and a lot of our hands are checking here, so we're very polarized. However, our strongest hands have improved. You've got two scenarios. You either give up here, which is completely fine because we do block spade combos, which is bad, right? Our opponents, we want our opponent to have a hand like king x of spades, king 10 of spades, king jack of spades, which would now have to fold the river, right? We block all of those, which sucks. We don't block ace queen, but we do block king queen. However, king queen is one of those hands we would potentially look to try and maybe make fold on this river. So what hands does our villain get here with? Well, I would be honest and I would suggest that he gets here mostly with a queen, whether it be queen 10, queen jack, king queen, or ace queen. Your options are either jam or check. So I'll be honest, I would actually much prefer a shove here, even with king 5 of spades blocking spade draws. We block king queen, which is one of his strongest kings, one of his strongest queens. And I feel like at your populations, the micro stakes and low stakes, your villains are not going to find a call here unless they specifically have ace queen or better. In my opinion, I don't think they're going to find enough hero calls with a hand like king queen, queen jack, queen 10. And I don't think they're going to slow play hands like pocket 8s and pocket 3s. And there's not many combos of them either. So I would absolutely consider the only size, if we're going to bet, be a shove, which would be like sort of 3x over bet jam. Or a check. You need to make a decision based on what opponent type you're against. If you're against a station, or if you're against a very tight opponent, I would consider giving this up. If I'm against most other opponents, I would look to shove this because our nutted edge has way got there. We have pocket queens, he doesn't. We have aces, he doesn't. We have all the other hands like pocket 8s, pocket trays. A lot of our bluffs have improved on. I mean, the only problem is a lot of our bluffs would have improved and not wanted to potentially bet this river for a shove size. That's why we need to take a huge size. So it's either give up or shove. Interesting, right? What I'm going to do is I'm going to stop this video and I'm going to move into part 2. So stay tuned.